to Art Pastor Live. A new day, a new time. Yeah, it's Friday, 4 p.m. here in the Central Standard Time. And you may be asking, why did you switch, Steve? Why are you doing 4 o'clock on a Friday? It's kind of a weird time. It's a good question. I'm glad you asked. Let me tell you why. Because all summer, as I've been experimenting with doing my live stream, I chose to do Thursday at 11 a.m. for one particular reason. Because in the school year, we have a regular practice on campus at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, where I'm a professor, that we call lunch church. And I love lunch church. And over the summer, we didn't have any chapel. Our seminary pastor resigned and things really slowed down over the summer. And so we just didn't have chapel at all. And so I decided to work from home on Thursdays and to live stream at 11 o'clock. And it kind of replaced lunch church for me, because live stream is an interesting experience, because it's a time for us to connect on, on the internet. And if you're with me live, you can interact with me and ask questions, leave comments. And I'm trying to see where my chats are on my screen. See if anybody's out there and able to leave a chat. So let me just check, make sure that you are on there. Yep, I see that you're there. Okay, cool. And excellent. Hopefully you can chat. Hopefully I can see the chat. For some reason, I'm not able to see the chat at the moment. Boom. That's the joy of live streaming, my friends. Oh, there we go. Now I can see it. Excellent. All right, so if you are with me live today, I'd love for you to just leave a chat and a comment. I'm on YouTube and Facebook. And if you aren't with me live, I understand. You might be watching this video later, and that's cool. And you might be watching it at double speed, because that's how I watch live stream recordings. All right, so let's talk about what this is, why we're doing what we're doing. My name is Steve Thomason. I am a visual artist. I draw and paint. I do animation. I love digital art. I'm also a professor of spiritual formation at Luther Seminary. And as of this weekend, I'm also going to be the dean of the chapel at Luther Seminary. And I am a pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And you put all that together, and that makes the Art Pastor. You go to artpastor.com. You can come to my website. You can see here that I explore spirituality and scripture through art and creativity. And as I'm switching to this Friday at 4 o'clock, let me tell you a couple reasons why. For me, it's like the official end of my work week. Our weeks are filled with activity. If your week is anything like mine, it's crammed with meetings and all kinds of great stuff, but it's really, really full. And my work week is Monday through Friday. And so as I come to the end of this work week on a Friday at 4 o'clock, it's a way for me to just kind of unwind and connect with you in a contemplative practice. And one of the things that I want to do with this live stream is just open up a space where I can share my practice with you. Because one of the things that I think is unique about how God has created me is that I am this weird and interesting fusion of visual art and theology. And so I think visually. And so whether I am doing a traditional painting or drawing, or if I'm doing some theological work where I'm wrestling with a theological concept, or working on an article or a lesson for one of my seminary classes, no matter what I'm doing, I'm usually drawing as a part of the process. And I love to use digital tools. I use lots of different software. And so what I want to do with this live stream is to just invite you into my working studio. And whatever I've been working on that day or that week, I want to invite you into it. So I don't know that I will always know exactly what our topic's going to be coming into Friday, but just know that I've always got something in the works and it's going to be interesting, hopefully. And so you might find it interesting on the theological side as I wrestle with theological concepts, or you might find it interesting on the artistic side, the visual art side, with a drawing technique or learning a new piece of software or whatever it is. And if you're like me, you'll find them both equally interesting. And if you have questions along the way or want to participate, feel free. So here's where we're going to go today. This whole week for me has been an interesting synergy of two big things. Let me switch over to my Cintiq here for a second, and I want to draw this out for you. So on the one hand, there has been I'm entering into this new phase of my life where I am now the dean of the chapel at Luther Seminary. Dean of the chapel. Like, and I've been trying to figure out, what does that mean? And one of the things that the dean of the chapel has to think about is, what is worship at Luther Seminary? And so a couple days ago on Wednesday, I had I did this big invitation, this meeting on campus that was open to anybody who is a part of the Luther Seminary campus life. And 18 people showed up, and I asked two big questions. The first question I asked was, what is the purpose of chapel at Luther Seminary? And then the second question was, what are your hopes for chapel this fall at Luther Seminary? And we spent about an hour and 10 minutes together, and I led them through this practice where each individual person writes down the answers to their questions independently on a piece of paper. Then they form into groups of three and they share their answers and they try to synthesize their answers into one answer for that group. And then those groups of three get together with another group of three and they read their responses to each other. And then as one big group of six, or in this case, one group was nine, they tried to synthesize all of their responses into one response. And it's a great method that I learned from a guy named Peter Block, who is in community building, community development. And I used this method during my dissertation. It's just a great way to help a group of people think together where everybody gets to have a voice. So anyway, that's what I did on Wednesday. And so that has been in my mind. And boy, I tell you, trying to figure out how to do worship for a community that is as diverse as Luther Seminary is quite a challenge, because if you don't know much about Luther Seminary, you may just know it as the largest seminary in the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And you might think, oh, everybody there is exactly the same. We're all Evangelical Lutheran Church people, and worship looks a certain way. Well, that is not true. We are a very diverse group, diverse in some ways and not diverse in other ways. But one way that we're diverse is we have a large representation of different theological traditions. We have a lot of ELCA folks, but even within the ELCA, there are multiple interpretations and expectations for what worship is. And then we have Methodists, we have Presbyterians, we have Baptists, we have Roman Catholics, we have some Mennonite, we have some Stone Campbell folks, we have and we have some Assemblies of God, different Pentecostal, and imagine all those people coming together and trying to have a meaningful worship experience together. That's a big challenge. How do you do that? And so I've been thinking about worship on that side, but then also on the other side, I have been working this summer on a course that is part of my overflow course that's called Loving God with Your Spirit. And I want to share that with you. So I'm going to switch back over to my web browser because if you come to artpastor.com, you'll see that right here on the homepage, if you click on spiritual formation, I've got a ton of information and resources for you around spiritual formation. If you scroll down, you'll see that this one of my resources is called the Overflow Principle. And this is a book that I wrote back in 2009. And that book was a combination of some work that I had been doing all throughout our house church experience. Our whole house church called Heart House was built on this principle called the Overflow Principle. And I in the last 2 years, I've been working on a series of courses for Faith+Lead Academy as part of my job at Luther Seminary. And I created an introduction to growing in faith called Overflow, and it's all built on that principle. And if you scroll down, you'll see I've got lots of information on it. But here's the basic idea behind the Overflow principle. I like to think of our lives as each human, we are comprised of three basic components. We have a mind, a spirit, and a body. Now, you can't separate those three things. And you can talk about them as three aspects of being human. Our mind is more of our intellect, our thinking, our rational thought. Our spirit is more of our emotions and that non-verbal, supra-rational connection that we have with the Spirit of God, with the Spirit of life itself. And that's kind of how I think of spirit. And then, of course, we have our physical bodies and the biochemistry that makes up who we are. And like, you can't have your mind and your spirit without your body. But we aren't just biochemical machines, all those kind of things, right? So that's the premise of my anthropology behind the overflow principle. And then the idea is that when we realize that God's love is flowing into our lives unconditionally, and that's the good news. That's the gospel. That's through Jesus Christ. We have access to the love of God, not based on anything that we've done. By the grace of God, by faith, we are saved through grace. By grace, we are saved through faith, right? And the biggest problem that most of us have is that we just we don't realize it. Maybe we don't think we're worthy, or maybe we think we have to earn it, and it can't be that free. And so part of our spiritual practice is to be able to just open our lives up to let the love of God flow into us freely. And when it fills us up, it overflows into our neighbors. And I talk about two categories of neighbors. We have a comfortable neighbor and we have the uncomfortable neighbor. And so in the overflow course, I introduced that. And as you can see in this image right here, there's like an overlap where I talk about those five things: mind, spirit, body, comfortable neighbor, and uncomfortable neighbor. And then I overlay the 7 spiritual practices. There are lots of spiritual practices, and these are not the only 7, but these are the 7 spiritual practices that are very commonly identified across multiple churches. And these are definitely the spiritual practices that the ELCA recognizes as 7 core practices. And I take those 7 core practices and then I match them up with these 5 components, and that's the course. And so, like, loving God with our mind, I did that course earlier this year, and it's going to be released sometime soon. And that course is really about how to be a lifelong learner, how to study, and how learning is a spiritual practice. And I really get into the weeds about how to study the Bible well, but it's more than just Bible study. And what I'm working on right now is loving God with our spirit, which is the spiritual practices of prayer and worship. And so this week I am finishing up. Let me go back to my Cintiq here. So this week I've been finishing up the overflow course, talking about worship. What is worship? How do we worship? Why is worship so difficult? And so you can see the synergy between these two things. Let me bring my Cintiq cam, my over-the-shoulder cam here so that you can see my hand. And so what I thought I would do today is accomplish a couple of things. One is I want to introduce you to this program that I've been working. I've been working on this all day today. And so everything that you're going to see in this live stream is stuff that I have done today in this program. And so first, let me introduce you to the software, and then I'm going to walk you through some of the theological stuff I've been drawing through. So I've literally been not writing my script. I have been drawing, visually thinking through this big question about worship. And so I hope you find it interesting. So what's the software? Well, it's called Toon Boom Storyboard Pro. And I love this software. I've been using Toon Boom and Storyboard for a long time. So this right here is my Wacom Cintiq. It's the Cintiq 16, which means it's a 16-inch monitor. And what the Cintiq is it is a pen tablet that is connected directly to my PC. And so unlike if you've watched previous live streams, I sometimes will draw on my iPad, and my iPad, is a Apple product. It's a standalone tablet that I can take anywhere. Well, the Cintiq is not portable and mobile. It's actually hardwired, not hardwired, but it is got a big thick wire, and it plugs directly into my PC. And I'm working on a iMac, an Apple iMac, a 27-inch screen iMac. So what you're looking at right here, this camera is just my FaceTime camera in the top of my iMac. So I've got my big screen that I'm looking at all this stuff and seeing your chats up there. And then I'm drawing down here on my Cintiq. But I don't have to, but the cool thing about the Cintiq is that it is a tablet screen built in. So it's just like drawing on a piece of paper. Okay, so the Toon Boom Pro is designed for storyboarding films, movies. And you can storyboard like live action movies, you can storyboard animation, it doesn't matter. But let me show you around it a little bit. I've got it in a really minimal format right now so that you can see what I'm drawing. But let me maximize this for a second, and I'll just show you around the software. So what we got right here is this panel itself. So the thing about storyboards is storyboard is a tool that filmmakers have been using for a long time. Like Walt Disney Studios was using this back in the 30s when they were doing all their films. And what it is you draw the shots of the film uh, in a shorthand form so that you can think through the movements and shots of a film visually before you commit to actually making the film. Now, if you've read my book, The Visual Preacher, you'll know that I have a whole chapter on how to visually write a sermon. And one of the methods that I talk about in that is storyboarding. Now you can storyboard using post-it notes. Okay, so you don't need all this fancy technology in order to do storyboarding. But if you do a lot of storyboarding and you like the digital technology, Toon Boom Storyboard Pro is amazing. I have done actual storyboards. I've done animatics for film proposals in this. I've storyboarded all of my other animations that I've done for previous courses in this software, and it's great. So a little tour around this. What you've got down here is you can see I've got each one of these little panels on the bottom is a storyboard. And if I use my keyboard shortcut F and A, I can go forward in my storyboards and I can go backwards in my storyboard. And it's super easy to navigate. And within each panel, it's a whole world into itself. And right here, let me expand this. The magic of all digital art software is layers. And so every panel comes with a background and an empty layer just ready to go. But you can add multiple layers. So like, let me come up here and add a layer, and I'll make this layer, I can make this layer disappear. And it's got tools. So I've got paintbrushes and pencils, and I've got text tools and erasers and shape tools and paint bucket, fill tools, all that kind of stuff. So I can choose my tool, and then over here is the tool properties, and it's got a whole library of brushes that I can use, like all the different drawing software. And it has a color palette that I can choose, and I can create my own colors. And I just created all these colors while I've been working today in this particular document. And as you can see, I can draw. And the cool thing about this stylus and working on a Cintiq is that you have thin to thick. This stylus is pressure sensitive, and so it's a lot like working with just natural media. I draw away, and it's responsive to my how much pressure I put onto the stylus, and if I want to get in and do really dark lines, and then if I want to make it bigger, I can just come over here and make it really a lot bigger, or I can make it smaller. It's amazing, and it has a lot of preset brushes. Okay, so that is Storyboard Pro. It's a powerful tool, and so what I want to do now is I want to use Storyboard Pro to walk through and just show you how I have been visually thinking through this particular script I've been trying to write for my course. And so let me close these windows just so that you can see maximum screen real estate here. I need a little drink of water. So when I approach a subject, or if I have a question that I'm trying to work through, I usually start with some kind of mind mapping. And you can see here that I've got, I'm going to just create a new layer, and actually I'm going to choose a blue, and just so I can just highlight. So the first thing I do is I draw my big question or my subject. And the question that I've been wrestling with all day is, why are there so many worship styles? So think about this. I've been doing this course on worship, trying to help people understand, like, what is worship. One of my modules it walks through Psalm 95, where we talk about worship. But one of the big questions that I think a lot of people have on a really practical level today is, how do you make sense out of the fact that there's so many different worship styles out there? Um, so my wife and I, we've been married 35 years. We grew up in our childhood, we grew up in Baptist churches, not together. We were in different states, but we had similar backgrounds. We grew up in a Baptist church, right? And so Baptists don't have sacraments. And for Baptists, especially the kind of Baptist that I was, worship was a time to get together and sing hymns. And hymns were more about either praising God, like saying thanks to God, or singing doctrine. Basically, it's a way to learn correct doctrine through music, and then listen to an expository sermon 45 minutes long, word for word. Like, that was what I was raised with. Like, that was worship to me. And as I grew, I went off to college, and as you go to college, you're exposed to new things. And I got involved in the Willow Creek Church movement, which was all about contemporary music. And, people aren't coming to church, and so we need to get them back to church. And we had all the worship boards of the 1980s. And so for 12 years, my wife and I attended, and I went on staff and became a pastor at an evangelical megachurch that had amazing contemporary music. And when I say contemporary music, basically mean soft rock 70s, like white people rock and roll, but on the lighter side. So the Christian contemporary music movement, Stephen Curtis Chapman, Chris Tomlin later on, that kind of music became worship music for us. And that was what it was expected. And that's what I came of age with. And so that kind of music is actually still today very meaningful for me, and I love it. And but we didn't have sacraments, we didn't have liturgy. I never had liturgy in my life at all. And then, we went through our house church movement, and I just wanted to blow up the whole institution of the church, not literally, metaphorically, wanted to deconstruct the whole institution of the church. And so we went through house church. And so like we how for so worship for us for 5 years was just gathering in a living room and praying together and studying scripture together and singing together and bringing something to God through our creativity together. And that was worship. And then I became an ELCA pastor. And oh, wow, I entered into a whole different world, a different culture of people who absolutely loved liturgy and the pipe organ. And if I didn't wear an alb and a stole, whew, they got upset. That was a foreign culture to me. And, I often joke that, like, I'm a theological refugee, that I had to leave my past because my theological imagination didn't quite match anymore. And I washed up on the shores of the ELCA, and they lovingly took me in as a theological refugee. So I don't quite fit, but they love me anyway. And I love being in the ELCA because it's a big tent and it allows us to have big questions and wrestle with our big questions, right? But the liturgical culture and worship of the ELCA is really a foreign language to me. And I've had for the last 14 years, I've learned to love it. I've learned to appreciate it, but it is still not my native language. And so this is a big thing, and it's really important to me. And so I'm wrestling with this. And so here we go. So why are there so many worship styles? And so, like, which is the right one? Where did they come from? How do I choose a worshiping community? I think that's a practical question. And what are the different styles? Okay, so now if I hit the F button, it just takes me to the next panel. And so I started thinking, right? So when I think visually, I just start drawing and writing and doodling, and I don't have to get it right, because the cool thing about this is I can mix and match. Like, I can move these panels back and forth. I can delete panels. I can do a whole series of panels, and if I don't like them, I can just delete them. It's fantastic. And so here's my train of thought, right? See if this makes any sense to you. I've also been doing a lot of reading lately in cultural anthropology and trying to understand why people are different, why people. Yeah, I'm reading this one book called The Moral Animal that's trying to understand why humans have morality at all. And a while ago, I read this book called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, and I did a full-blown color illustration of that book. And so I've got a lot of this cultural anthropology in my mind. And so that's influencing a lot of what I'm thinking about here. And so I'm trying to remove as much as possible, trying to remove my bias, my theological bias of what I think worship should be. And I want to just, and even my theological bias that there is God in the way that I understand God. And I want to just think about it from a human aspect, as if I were a cultural anthropologist who's just observing the movements of humans over history. And so here we go. Let's think about this. So you've got basic human needs, right? Humans, if you're just looking at this like from an evolutionary perspective, humans want to survive. All life wants to survive. And there's four basic things that we need to survive. We need food, we need water, we need shelter from the dangerous elements around us, and we need procreation. Because if we don't make more humans, we're not going to survive, right? And so, throughout history, what humans have discovered and why we are communal creatures is that we can meet those needs best in community. And a community shares certain things. It shares language, food, sexual behavior, clothes, music, dance, governance, economics, right? When a group of people get together and we agree on those kinds of things, then our community can actually foster um, life, and it helps us to get food, the water that we need, the shelter that we need, and the procreation that we need in order to propagate our species, right? Now, you combine all of those things together, our music, our stories, our clothing, our food, all those things, and we call that culture. But there's also another word for it, and it's religion. The word religion is religio. It's based on the Latin word religare, which means to bind together. And it's where you can see the word where we get ligament from. And so religion are the practices that unite a group of people in their cultural identity. And so religion's a good thing. It's a beautiful thing, an important thing. Now, I'm borrowing a cultural anthropology term called the sacred canopy. And so if you think about like all the tribes, all the groups of people all over the planet throughout history, one thing that humans have in common until very recently is some idea of the divine. And we call it the sacred canopy. Like there is something bigger than us that is up there, out there, in here, around us, but more than us, and it's mysterious. And so, how do we define the sacred canopy? So, one of the basic questions that every grouping of people has to ask is, how do we relate to the divine? And how does the divine communicate with us? How do we communicate with the divine? These are core theological concepts. And our concept, think about this, our concept of the divine shapes our worship. Let me tell you what I mean. Because one of the questions that we ask as humans as we look up into the heavens, just imagine a pre-modern world without light pollution, without the noise of technology. You just have You're out in the woods and you're looking up at the starry sky. You see the sun that overpowers all the lights of the night sky. And then in the night, you have all these amazing stars, and you have the moon that changes shapes as it moves. And then you have planets that seem to be wanderers through all this stuff. What is all of that? And what is the power of the wind and the lightning and the clouds and the water? And, storms are terrifying. There's got to be something behind all of this, right? And so most societies throughout human history have thought of the divine in a plural sense. There are gods, right? And so the question is, what are the gods like? And so if the gods are angry and demanding, so let's say that you are observing earthquakes and volcanoes and hurricanes and lightning strikes and people dying, you might conclude that the gods are angry and demanding. And so, if that's what the gods are like, then your worship might take the form of appeasing the gods, like maybe they demand sacrifice and you need to obey them. So you have all of these um, religions in the ancient world that demanded human sacrifice. Like, give us your children, burn your children in the fire because the gods are angry and demanding. But what if the gods are aloof and ambivalent? There are some mythologies that talk about how the gods are like, oh, humans, they're kind of cute. Like a lot of the ancient mythologies around the gods and humans um, explained the creation of humanity as an accidental byproduct of the gods being at war with each other. And so you have these little humans that kind of pop up out of the mud or pop up out of the blood of a slain god, and they're like, oh, they're kind of annoying. Like they're little creatures, right? And so some gods just want to crush them. They hate them. Some gods treat them kind of like cute little bunnies, right? Oh, they're so cute and they're nice, but I'll eat them eventually. Um, so they might be aloof and ambivalent. And so if the gods are kind of hard to get hold of or hard to get you to help them, your worship might take the form of coercing the gods. And so, like a lot of the ancient Canaanite worship was very sexual in the sense that um, they believed that the fertility of the crops was related to the sexual activity of the gods. And so they were trying to like arouse the gods to make sure that they could have fertile crops, right? So that's what I mean by like coercing the gods or getting the gods to do things for you, kind of a tit for tat kind of relationship. Or what if your gods aren't personalities at all? But what if your understanding of the divine is more that the divine and the sacred canopy is more like impersonal forces, that there are energies at play in the universe, but they don't have a relational quality to them. You can't talk to them, you can't have a relationship. They don't hate you, they don't love you. They just are the energies of the universe. And if that's how you understand the divine, then your worship might take the form of manipulating the energies. And this is what a lot of like the magical arts are about, is learning the wisdom and movements of the spiritual energies, cosmic energies, to manipulate them to do what you want them to do. And it may or may not have a personal God aspect to it. Um, but what if the gods are loving, relational creators of all of life? And that's how you imagine the gods. Then your worship would take the form of giving thanks to God for the gift of life. And your worship would be trying to seek how to be faithful in your relationship with God. Now, I will say that this is how the ancient Hebrews understood the divine. And the word for God in some of the Hebrew literature is Elohim, which is plural. So there was baked into ancient Hebrew theology the plurality of God and also the unity of God. And eventually, over the centuries, they became really strong monotheists, that there is just one God. But there was always, I mean, they believed that all the gods of all the Baals um, answered to the one true God, right? So anyway, but my point here is that the Hebrew people really believed in that God was a loving God and a creator who cared for the creation. And that's important as it passes down through the Jesus story and into the Christian church. Okay, so regardless of which view of the divine or the gods you have, your worship expression of the gods is going to be expressed through the cultural media, right? So if every culture, if every grouping of people finds its identity and safety within a particular culture, like they speak the same language, they eat the same food, they have the same sexual behavior or mores around their sexuality, they wear the same kind of clothes, they have the same music and they dance the same way, they govern themselves the same way, they have the same kind of economics. All of these things are what define a culture. This is what we call worship. And what the argument I'm trying to make here is that worship is very, very intricately intertwined with culture. And that is one of the main reasons why people get so adamant about their style of worship, because our worshiping style is really connected to our sense of identity. And our identity is connected to our sense of the group to which we belong. Keep that in mind as we keep going. So here's one of the interesting circles of this reality, is that our cultural identity forms our worship style. And then our worship style forms our cultural identity. So which comes first, the chicken or the egg? I don't know. Um, and I've heard Richard Rohr say this. I don't know if he originated it, but he has said it many times that we become the God that we worship. And so it's a fascinating thing, the study of worship. Okay, so that's one argument, right? Culture, worship, style are connected. So throughout human history, you have these various tribal identities that have evolved around worship styles. And so, right, for the sake of this argument, I'm just going to talk about like three. We have worship A, you have worship B, and you have worship C. And these three different worships could be worshiping completely different gods and different ideas. So maybe worship A sees an angry, belligerent God, and they're trying to appease the gods. Maybe worship B sees kind of an aloof God. Maybe worship C sees a loving God. We don't know, right? But they're all different from each other. And throughout history, as these different tribes, um, some tribes migrated around, and as tribes would encounter each other, they'd be like, oh, there's some people that we don't know, and they're really different than us. So what do we do with them? And so you have these encounter between the tribes. And so sometimes the tribes would be like, let's just stay away from each other because they're so different. Sometimes they would be like, hey, you're interesting. Let's talk. And maybe we can form a peace treaty with each other and learn from each other. Or maybe it'd be like, nope, you're different. Therefore, you're wrong. So, and you have something that we want. So, we're going to kill you. We're going to go to war. And so, you have all these different ways that tribes interact throughout history. Um, so, that's one thing. Now, another thing I've been thinking about, again, this is me just spending the whole day doodling through all of this. I've been just drawing this, thinking through this out visually. Um, and eventually, hopefully before Tuesday, this will come out in a script that I can put together and do a video that makes sense, unlike the rambling that I'm doing right now. So another thing I was thinking about is that there's three ways, basically. I know I'm being really simplistic about this, but there's like three basic ways that humans can kind of group themselves. The most basic and core way is around a tribe, a group of people, and the most basic core kind of tribe is just a family unit. And some tribes are just, many tribes are just extended families, that have maybe 50 to 300 people in them, and that's a tribe. And they have their own language, right? I mean, if you go to Indonesia today, there's still like hundreds and hundreds of language groups living in isolation in remote places. It's amazing. So this tribal life is one way that humans group and form identity. Another way is that you can have larger tracts of land and larger groups of people that are similarly connected in their cultural identity. And they might form a large enough group and have boundaries around where their group lives. We might call that a country. And that country, in the ancient world, countries were more homogenous, and a country shared a culture. And again, remember, culture is defined by shared language, shared food, shared stories, shared music, shared dress, all that kind of stuff. But I also wanted to highlight another way that people can be a people group, and that is empire. And this comes into play when we read through scripture, because it's one thing to be a country and just try to, live and let live and try to be a healthy country. But sometimes countries can rise and grow larger. And when they look out across the horizon, further past the horizon, and they see other countries, they can see that those other countries have resources that they want. And so instead of entering into like peaceful negotiations between countries, some countries feel, for one reason or another, that they have the right to go and conquer another country. And when one country starts conquering another country, we call that an empire, right? They're trying to build an empire. And you build an empire on conquering another cultural group and bringing those cultural groups into servitude to your cultural ideal. And that is empirical colonization, right? Okay, so it's like, well, that's really fascinating, Steve. I didn't realize I signed up for a cultural anthropology course. What does that have to do with worship today? Well, that's a great question. So let's talk about the history of worship. So let's start with worship in the Hebrew culture. And the reason we're starting with Hebrew culture is because I'm a disciple of Jesus, right? I have inherited Christian worship practices, but I have to recognize that that is because Jesus was a Jewish man and inherited this deep cultural heritage from the Hebrew culture. And so when you zoom it now, I like to start with this big world map because this little green box is where the story of the Jewish people starts with Abraham. And look at how small that box is compared to the entire planet. And it's really important to remember that right here in, let me get this out. Uh, right here in roughly 2000 years before Jesus is when Abraham came on the scene. And you'll notice that over here, the pyramids in Egypt were already hundreds of years old when Abraham went to Egypt. And so, like, humans have been around for a really long time, and a lot of culture had evolved before Abraham came on the scene. And so one of the big questions we have to ask ourselves is why Abraham? Why does it start with Abraham? And just a lay of the land when Abraham was there, we see um, tribes, lots and lots of tribal life and identity all across this region. But we also have more developed like Egypt. Egypt is not necessarily yet an empire because it isn't out trying to conquer everybody, but it could be considered an empire because it didn't become this big without tribes somehow consolidating into one larger group called Egypt. Okay, so that's Abraham's time. Now, if we go forward, oh, and Abraham, when we talk about worship, right? Abraham is a nomad. He leaves his homeland of Ur the Chaldeans and he travels 1,400 miles over here to the land of Canaan, where it's just a whole smattering of tribes that are fighting with each other because each tribe has its own god or the Baals of the Canaanites. And Abraham doesn't have a fixed form of worship. We have this one strange story in Genesis where Abraham meets a high priest from Salem called Melchizedek. And he's like, okay, I'll give a tenth of my spoils of war to the God, the Most High God that Melchizedek serves. Like, what's that all about? There was no structure for Abraham at this point. Now we fast forward 400, 600 years after Abraham, after the children of Israel were enslaved for 400 years in Egypt. We come now, so they spent their whole time incubating in the land of Egypt. And we come to the story of Exodus, where Moses leads the people to Mount Sinai. And out at Mount Sinai, the children of Israel, the Moses encounters the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And at Mount Sinai gives instructions for the people on how to be a people. And part of being a people is having a culture and having worship practice. Now, so it's kind of like what God does for the people is gives them an instant culture packet, just like, okay, here's your culture. You've been slaves for 400 years. Now, here's how to be a nation. Here's how to be a people. And it has three big components to the law. It has feast days. As they track through the seasons of the year, you recognize the calendar through feasts and you worship God and you get in rhythm with the earth through the feast days. And then there are sacrifices that need to be made. And the sacrifices had lots of different purposes, but there was a lot of animal sacrifice in the ancient world. And remember, animals were part of the economics of the society. And so you would bring the animals to God and sacrifice them. And then there was the civil law, like how to treat each other. And it was all centered on this structure called the tabernacle. And this is an overview shot of how the tribes were organized. And so you had the tabernacle at the center, and then you had the 12 tribes of Israel that would encamp around them. And God, the glory of God would fill the tabernacle. And so you have God manifest physically in the center of the camp. And then the structure of their worship is they had a high priest who was the only one who was allowed into the Holy of Holies. And then you had priests who ministered to the tribes themselves. And then you had the tribes. And so you had this kind of process that the person had to go through to be in relationship with God. And that was the law and the religion and the worship that Moses gave to the people from Mount Sinai. And so when we move through the history, Moses, the thing about the tabernacle is that it was mobile, like it was moving all around the wilderness, and the people just followed the tabernacle as they were following the cloud. And after Joshua goes in and settles and has all the battles with all the Canaanite tribes and lots of warfare, Israel is now a federation of tribes, and they have no centralized anything. And there's still just the tabernacle, which is somewhere around here in Shiloh. And so they're also surrounded by Canaanite tribes, gods, and their forms of worship. And so you have these 300 years of the Israelites struggling with their cultural identity in relation to all the Canaanites. And then you come to 2 Samuel, where David becomes the king and he unifies the tribes. And they're still surrounded by the Canaanites. And David is trying to bring people into the worship of God and the proper worship of God and their cultural identity. And then in 1 Kings, David's son Solomon takes over, and he replaces the tabernacle by building this fixed structure called the temple, which is built on the same blueprint as the tabernacle. But now things have radically changed, because instead of being mobile, now they are fixed in a building. And so the worship of God from the Hebrew people is still built on these three things: the feast, the sacrifices, and the law, but it's all now fixed in a permanent building in Jerusalem. Well, things go badly after Solomon. He taxes the people to build the temple. He breaks all the laws around the king, and we enter into a new era of human history, the rise of empires, where we have one empire after another that is just gobbling up more and more real estate. And Israel is caught right in the center of all of it. And in 586, the Babylonian Empire comes in and destroys the temple in Jerusalem, Solomon's temple, and it lays fallow for 70 years. And then Persia brings the people back and they rebuild the temple. So we have this second temple, and it goes for many centuries. And then we come to the time of Jesus. And when Jesus arrives on the scene, the Roman Empire has brought peace, the peace of Rome, quote unquote, peace to the world by conquering everybody and trying to bring all of these various tribes and all their different worships of the various gods under the rule of one Caesar, one Lord and Savior, Caesar of Rome. And that's this climate that Jesus comes into. And another aspect of worship in Jesus' day was that this second temple that was built, Herod spends 40 years expanding the temple and turning it into one of the wonders of the world. It's this beautiful temple with lots of gold and marble, and it's amazing. And he's spending so much money, and he's taxing his people, and the Romans are taxing his people, and the people are suffering because of it. And Jesus says eventually that temple is going to be destroyed. And it happened. And in AD 70, the temple was destroyed. And now the people were left with a problem. What do they do? What does worship look like? Because without the temple, without the sacrifices, what is their cultural worshiping identity? Well, the Jews were left without a temple. They had no more sacrificial system. They had no more centralized building to unify them. So what unified them was their feast days and their law. And what happened during the time of the Pharisees and the centuries, a couple centuries after the destruction of the temple, you have this rise of the Pharisaical Judaism, where the law and the scripture become central, and the obedience to the law and following the dietary laws, following the sexual mores, wearing the right clothes, telling the right stories becomes this rigid cultural boundary between Jews and Gentiles. And the Gentiles were just not allowed. And this is the battle that the Apostle Paul is facing and the early disciples of Jesus are facing. So this is what the book of Acts is all about, because the beginning of the book of Acts starts in Jerusalem, where we have the big temple of Herod on the day of Pentecost, when all the Jews are coming for a big feast day and to make their sacrifices at the temple. And the Holy Spirit comes on Jesus' disciples, and they get up in front of the crowd and they start speaking in all of these languages. And remember, what's one of the cultural identifiers? Is language. And so now the good news of Jesus is being proclaimed in more than one language all over the world. And so the message of Jesus spreads across the world and encounters multiple cultures. Uh, we have it's within the Jews in Judea. It's with the Jews who have been dispersed throughout the empire. But we know that it went to India and China, to Ethiopia and to Africa, to the Greeks, the Romans, and into the European tribes right from the beginning. And so one of the questions we have to ask about worship is, how does the message of Jesus impact the culture when it encounters it? Does it try to change the culture and turn it into like what one of Paul's problems was, is there were Jewish disciples of Jesus who felt like they basically had to colonize people and turn them into Jews before they could actually worship God and the Messiah in Jesus. And Paul's like, no, that's not what the good news of Jesus does. The good news of Jesus comes into a culture and transforms it from the inside. And so the worship of God is going to look different based upon each different culture. And so that's something to think about deeply. And so if we continue through church history, um, man, I've been talking and I'm running out of time. If we go through church history, um, we have the imperial church, we have the Christian empire, we have the rise of Islam in 700, we have the great schism in 1054 between the Greeks and the Latins, we have the Latin, the Christian Christendom of Western Europe for 500 years, and the sacred canopy. So what happened in the Western church was that there became this monocultural identity around what worship looks like. It was built upon the sacraments. It was built upon a hierarchical structure where the Pope was the high priest and the priests, and you had the wealthy men, and there was this hierarchy of being. And Latin was the language that unified the Latin church. Well, eventually, and so this is what church looked like in Western Europe. You had a church in every village, and it was literally the center of everything, right? And all of culture was at the center. Well, here's the problem. Over time, Latin became a dead language, and only the intellectual magisterium of the church could speak Latin. And the common people couldn't speak Latin. They were disconnected from the scripture, from the church, from what was going on in worship. And so you have Martin Luther, the Reformation, it all breaks loose. And quite simply put, you have the Western Church for the next 300 years looks like this. You have Roman Catholics who stay true to Latin and the authority of the Pope. And then you have various expressions of Protestantism in Northern Europe. And so you have different divides. You have theological divides between Lutherans, Calvinists, and Anabaptists. And then you have language divides. You have the cultural divides of the English-speaking people, the Germans, the Swedish, the Norwegians, the Danish, the Finnish, and so on, all of these different language and cultural groups. And they each evolve their own distinctive worship styles. And so for the next couple hundred years, you have these little tribal identities forming again amongst Protestants, where their worship styles are evolving again to reflect their own cultural identity. And then, after Christopher Columbus, you have this whole era of colonization, where you have Protestants, specifically the British Empire, colonizing as many people groups as they can for economic reasons, and the church is riding on its coattails. You have the Roman Catholic Church going into what we call Central and South America, and then you have everybody in Europe taking Africans and bringing them to this quote unquote new world, enslaving them, and also trying to exterminate the indigenous people. And then you have the Industrial Revolution, which just accelerates the expansion of these empires. And then in the late 1800s, you have this new influx of European immigrants who are non-English speaking European immigrants. And they bring their tribal identity of worship into the United States, which is predominantly an English speaking form of Protestant worship. And so you also have the Age of Enlightenment, where you have this divide between the public and the private. And suddenly, for the first time in human history, there is a divide in our culture between our worshiping life and our public life. And for the first time in human history, it is possible to actually say there is no such thing as a God, because faith is relegated to the private sector. And the only thing that's allowed in the public sector is human reason built on the foundation of the scientific method and the myth of progress. And the sacred canopy is politics and economics. There's a lot packed in that. So you have this radical individual eye. So here's what American villages looked like in the 1880s to the 1940s, is every town had a town hall, school, and multiple churches, because each of these churches represented a cultural identity that had migrated to this land from Europe. Some were Roman Catholic, and the rest were various expressions of Protestantism. And they built separate churches because why? Because worship is a core cultural identity. And so that's why you have Swedish Lutheran churches and Norwegian Lutheran churches, and you have particular forms of Baptist churches and all of these different expressions. And there, in the late 1800s and the turn of the 1900s, you have this idea, what some people call the age of association, where suddenly the modern individual I has the ability to choose what church they want to go to. And the association I choose shapes me. But what has been happening in the last 50 years is that the acceleration of technology has just obliterated the ability for humans to gather together in associations that create identity. And where we stand today is this moment where what modern Western society tells us is that each one of us is a radically individual I, and that I am in control of my own destiny, and that I must actually author myself. My culture doesn't define me. My group doesn't define me. I define me, and I choose who I want to associate with, or if I want to associate with anybody at all. And that is the myth of the autonomous self that we're living with today. And it's why we are struggling so much with mental health and hopelessness, is because we have become radically disconnected. And so, what does this have to do with worship? How do I choose a worshiping community? Well, here's the thing. There's this thing called a bounded set. So when we as human beings, when we are in a situation that is out of control and scary, our natural tendency is to hunker down and find people who are just like us, like those tribes, and build a bounded set around ourselves for protection. And that's natural, and that makes sense. But the reality is that because of our technology of transportation and communication, we as humans have been thrown together on this land like a big tossed salad. There is no single place where everybody is of the same tribe anymore. Especially, I'm talking about North America, and especially I live in a suburban context. Like, people are just disconnected and scattered, and everywhere you go, you're encountering people who are radically different than you. And that can be very disconcerting. And so our natural tendency is to be scared, especially in this highly polarized world that we live in right now. And so what we want to do is we want to retreat to our bounded sets. And so when people are looking for a church, they're looking for a place that makes them feel safe and comfortable. And that's natural because, again, worship is a core of our identity. But Jesus, I think the good news of Jesus creates a different message. Jesus didn't come to create a bounded set that you're either in or out. I think what Jesus came to do was to give us a centered set of his way of loving God and loving neighbor that can transform every culture from the inside out. And in this tossed salad mixed ecology experience and reality that we're having right now, what if rather than hunkering down with people who are just like us, what if we did a both and, where our worship styles, we can worship in places that make us feel comfortable. So I have a bottom line here that I just want to leave you with. Here's four points. One, we need to remember that every church reflects a culture. We also need to remember that no one church can reflect every culture. Like, there is no one church that everybody will feel comfortable in. It's just impossible. I think it's just absolutely impossible. And so we each need to find a church that matches our cultural style and then stick with that church. And then make sure that we know that the church we're in understands that it is not the only way to worship or the correct way to worship, but that it is a reflection of our cultural style to worship God, who is beyond our understanding. And the reason I follow Jesus is because Jesus is a human who showed me what the love of God looks like in human form. And if I follow the way of Jesus, it's probably going to be okay. Boom. Wow, that's a lot. So this is what I've been doing all day. I've just been drawing. Let me come back here to my opening screen. Hey, thanks for those of you who maybe were with me through this. You're amazing. And I've just been talking and rambling, drawing. That's how my brain works, I think, visually. Toon Boom Storyboard Pro is a great way to do this kind of work. And now what I'm going to do is take all of these thoughts, these visuals, and try to write out a script for a video that will be very clear and very concise. So thanks for joining me. Art Pastor Live every Friday at 4. I'm just going to finish my week out, invite you into my process. And the reason I do this is so that together we can grow deeper in the love of God through Jesus Christ and the power of the Holy Spirit for the sake of the world. So thanks for joining me. See you next week.